My mother looked me straight in the eye and said, "Get out of my house, and don't come back." The dining room went completely still. Somewhere down the table, a fork clinked against a plate. That was the only sound. 30 seconds ago, we were passing the gravy. Now I was being told to leave on Thanksgiving night, in front of my 9-year-old son, in front of the guests, in front of everyone who had ever watched me try to hold this family together. Across the table, my sister Lisa lifted her wine glass with a slow, satisfied smile. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. My son Ethan reached under the table and found my hand. His fingers were trembling. I squeezed back, hard, and I kept my face completely calm. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just looked at my mother, then at the house around us, and I thought to myself, none of them know. None of them have any idea. At that moment, not a single person in that room knew. I already had the legal power to make every one of them leave. Hi everyone, I'm Emma. I'm 38 years old, I live in Seattle, Washington, and I'm a real estate attorney. The story I'm about to tell you happened on Thanksgiving night, 2023. It was the night I lost my family. Or maybe, if I'm being honest with myself, it was the night I finally stopped pretending I had one. I'm sharing this now, 2 years later, because I've had enough time to process it, and because I know a lot of you out there have been in situations where the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally made you feel like the problem every single time. So let me take you back. I'm a single mom. It's just me and my son Ethan, and honestly, that little boy is the reason I get up every morning and put on my game face. I work long hours, I handle complicated property law cases, and I've built a life I'm genuinely proud of. But family, that's always been the complicated part. My sister Lisa is 4 years younger than me. Growing up, she was the one who got the extra help, the extra grace, the extra everything. When she wanted to study abroad, my parents paid for it. When she needed a car, they bought her one. When her first business idea flopped, they covered her losses without a single lecture. And me? I was always told, "You're doing fine, Emma. You don't need it." That phrase followed me for decades. You're doing fine, Emma, which really just meant, you're stable, so you can sacrifice. 6 months before that Thanksgiving dinner, Lisa came to me with a request that I knew, deep in my gut, was going to break something between us permanently. At the time, I told myself I was just making a responsible decision. I told myself I was protecting my son and my finances. And I was right, but I had no idea how much it was going to cost me. 6 months later, that decision came back, at the worst possible dinner of my life. It started in my office, on a Tuesday afternoon in early May. I remember it clearly because I had just finished a particularly brutal closing on a commercial property deal, and I was finally sitting down with a cup of coffee, actually looking forward to 5 quiet minutes. That's when my assistant knocked and told me Lisa was in the lobby. No appointment, no heads-up text, just there. Right away, something felt off. Lisa never came to my office. In the 12 years I'd been practicing law, she had visited exactly once, and that was only because she needed me to notarize something for free. I told my assistant to send her in. Lisa walked through the door, and the first thing I noticed was how she looked. My sister is the kind of person who always has everything put together, hair, outfit, nails, the whole thing. But that afternoon she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were red around the edges, and she was gripping her bag so tight her knuckles had gone pale. She sat down across from me without being invited, exhaled slowly, and then finally looked up and said, with a voice just barely holding steady, "I need your help, Emma. My startup is in serious trouble." I set my coffee down and waited. She told me everything in a rush, like she'd been rehearsing it the whole drive over. Her tech startup, which she'd been running for 3 years, had burned through its funding. A key investor had pulled out at the last minute. She had outstanding vendor contracts, 2 employees she couldn't pay, and a line of credit that was about to go into default. She needed to secure a new business loan fast, $250,000 to keep the whole thing from collapsing. And she needed me to co-sign. The moment those words came out of her mouth, my attorney brain kicked in automatically. I started running through the numbers. The liability exposure, what co-signing on a loan that size would actually mean for my financial standing, my credit, my ability to borrow if I ever needed to. And none of it was good. I leaned forward and said, keeping my voice even and professional, "Lisa, walk me through the business financials. Revenue, burn rate, current liabilities." She shifted in her seat and said, a little defensively, "I didn't bring the full documents. I just need to know if you're in." Right there, that told me almost everything I needed to know. I pressed anyway. Over the next 20 minutes, I pulled out what I could. The revenue numbers were weak. The burn rate was unsustainable. There was no clear path to profitability in the next 18 months, and the investor who had pulled out had done so specifically because of concerns about the business model. Co-signing that loan wouldn't be helping Lisa build something, it would be strapping myself to a sinking ship and handing someone else the life jacket. I sat back and took a breath. Then I said, carefully but clearly, "I can't sign on this, Lisa. Not with these numbers. If the business defaults, I'm on the hook for $250,000. I'm a single mom. That's not a risk I can take with Ethan depending on me." For a second, she just stared at me. Then something shifted in her expression, and she leaned forward and said, her voice dropping into that particular tone she'd been using on me since we were kids, "Emma, I'm your sister. I'm not some random client. Family helps family. That's what we do." And there it was. The card she always played. The one that was supposed to override everything. The numbers, the risk, the logic, my own financial survival. Family helps family. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, that old guilt reflex I'd spent years trying to work through, but I held my ground. I said, quietly but without wavering, "I love you. And because I love you, I'm not going to sign something that could financially destroy both of us. That's not me being selfish. That's me being honest with you." She stood up slowly. She picked up her bag, and she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as cold. Something past disappointment. Something that had already decided I was the enemy. She walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame, and said without turning around, "I'll remember this, Emma." Then she was gone. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty chair across from my desk. Part of me wanted to call her back. Part of me wondered if I was wrong, if I was being too rigid, too calculated. But the bigger part of me, the part that had spent 12 years reading contracts and understanding exactly what words on paper actually mean, knew I'd made the right call. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. When my mom called to invite me to Thanksgiving, something felt off. I couldn't explain it right away. It wasn't anything she said specifically. It was more about what she didn't say. "No, I can't wait to see you. No, Ethan must be getting so big. Just a flat, almost rehearsed. We're doing Thanksgiving at the house. You should come." I remember standing in my kitchen holding my phone, staring out the window at the gray Seattle sky, trying to figure out why that simple sentence had put a knot in my stomach. I asked, keeping my tone casual, "Is everything okay, Mom?" There was a pause, just a half-second too long, before she said, "Everything's fine. It'll be the whole family." I noticed she didn't ask if I wanted to come. She didn't say she missed me. It was framed like an obligation, like I was being summoned more than invited. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "Lisa's been staying here for a little while. I just want everyone together." And there it was. Lisa had moved back in. I didn't know how long she'd been there, and my mom clearly wasn't offering details. I wanted to ask follow-up questions. How long? Why? What happened with the apartment Lisa had been renting? But something in my mom's tone told me that line of questioning wasn't going to be welcomed, so I just said, "Okay. Ethan and I will be there." After I hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a good 5 minutes without moving. The rational part of my brain was already assembling the picture. Lisa's startup had likely collapsed. She'd moved back home. She had 6 months of built-up resentment toward me for not co-signing that loan. And now we were all going to sit around the same table and pretend to be grateful. When I told Ethan we were going to Grandma's for Thanksgiving, his whole face lit up. He dropped whatever he was doing, grabbed my arm with both hands, and said, practically bouncing, "Yes. Is Grandma making the sweet potato thing with the marshmallows on top?" Right then, looking at his face, something twisted quietly in my chest. He was 9 years old. He didn't know about the loan. He didn't know about Lisa. He didn't feel the tension humming underneath that phone call. All he knew was that Thanksgiving meant Grandma's house, and Grandma's house meant good food and family. I managed a smile and said, "Yeah, buddy, she'll make the sweet potato thing." But even as I said it, a low, persistent unease was settling somewhere behind my ribs. In the days leading up to Thanksgiving, I kept second-guessing myself. I'd pick up my phone to call my mom back and ask if we could talk before the dinner. Then I'd put it down. I'd draft a text to Lisa twice, something neutral, something that opened a door, and delete it both times. I didn't know what I would even say. "Hey, sorry I wouldn't risk my son's financial future for your business?" There was no version of that conversation that ended well before we were all in the same room. So I did what I always did. I told myself it would probably be fine. I told myself I was overthinking it. I told myself that whatever tension existed, we were adults, and we could get through one dinner. I packed Ethan's overnight bag, made a pie from scratch because I always brought something, and I drove us to my mother's house on Thanksgiving afternoon with the radio on, and my son singing along to something in the back seat. But as I turned onto my mother's street and saw the familiar house at the end of the block, the feeling didn't go away. It got heavier. By the time I parked outside that house and cut the engine, Ethan was already unbuckling his seatbelt, excited and completely unguarded. I sat there for just a moment longer, both hands still on the steering wheel, looking at the front door. I knew something was waiting for me inside. I just didn't know yet how bad it was going to get. At first, everything looked like a normal family dinner. That's the thing about these situations. They never start with someone flipping the table. They start with casserole dishes and small talk and everyone pretending the air isn't thick enough to choke on. My mom had decorated the dining room the way she always did for Thanksgiving. The good tablecloth, the ceramic turkey centerpiece that had been sitting in the same spot on that table since I was 7 years old. Candles lit, the smell of roasted turkey filling the whole house. For about 30 seconds when I walked in, I almost convinced myself I'd been wrong. Almost. My mom greeted Ethan first, wrapping him in a hug and saying warmly, "There's my boy. You're getting so tall." Then she looked at me over his shoulder and said, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, "Glad you made it, Emma. Not so good to see you. Not I'm happy you're here. Just glad you made it." Like I was a package that had been delayed in shipping. I handed her the pie I'd brought and said, "Thanks for having us, Mom." She took it without looking at it and carried it straight to the kitchen. Lisa was already there when I walked into the living room. She was standing near the fireplace, holding a glass of white wine, talking to my Aunt Carol. She looked better than she had in my office 6 months ago, put together again, composed. When she saw me, she didn't come over. She didn't wave. She just held my gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then turned back to Carol and kept talking. That 2-second look told me everything. She wasn't going to make a scene right away. She was going to make me wait for it. The other guests filtered in over the next half hour. My aunt and uncle, a couple of my mom's neighbors she'd invited because she always said the table felt empty with just family, and my mom's oldest friend Patricia, who had known all of us since we were kids. Ethan found his place immediately, parking himself next to my Aunt Carol, who always had gum in her purse and thought everything he said was hilarious. Watching him settle in so easily, so comfortably, I felt a wave of something I couldn't quite name. Relief that he was okay, and underneath that, a quiet dread about what was coming. We sat down to dinner around 5 o'clock. The first 20 minutes were textbook surface-level family conversation. My uncle talked about a fishing trip. Patricia asked Ethan about school. My mom passed the rolls and made sure everyone's glass was full. And Lisa smiled and nodded and played the role of pleasant younger daughter so smoothly that if I hadn't known what I knew, I might have believed it. But I did know. And so I watched. I watched the way Lisa's jaw tightened slightly every time I spoke. I watched my mom redirect conversation away from anything I brought up. Not aggressively, just consistently, the way you change a TV channel without making a big deal of it. I watched the way Patricia kept glancing between me and Lisa like she was trying to read a weather map. Ethan, to his credit, was completely oblivious and absolutely delightful. He told a long, winding story about something that had happened at school involving a broken water fountain and his best friend Marcus, and he told it with such commitment and detail that even I laughed for real. For about 5 minutes, the tension lifted. Then Lisa refilled her wine glass. That was the first signal. I'd grown up with Lisa. I knew what a second glass of wine at a family dinner meant. It meant the performance was about to get harder for her to maintain. My mom started talking about the holidays coming up, Christmas plans, whether people were traveling. I joined in carefully, keeping my answers short and light. I wasn't going to be the one to start anything. I was going to get through this dinner, get Ethan home, and figure out next steps from a safe distance. But even as I was thinking that, I could feel the temperature in the room shifting. Lisa got quieter, not relaxed, quiet, tight quiet. The kind of quiet that's actually just pressure building up behind a closed door. Ethan leaned over at one point and whispered to me, with the matter-of-fact honesty that only a 9-year-old can pull off. "Mom? Why is Aunt Lisa staring at you like that?" I kept my voice completely steady and whispered back, "She's just tired, buddy. Eat your turkey." But my hands, hidden under the edge of the table, had already found each other and locked together. The turkey was good. The sweet potatoes were exactly what Ethan had hoped for. Everything on that table looked like Thanksgiving was supposed to look. And yet every single person in that room over the age of 15 knew that we were not actually having a peaceful family dinner. We were just waiting for the moment when we'd stop pretending we were. Then Lisa stood up. And everything changed. Lisa stood up slowly, like she'd been planning this moment all day. Maybe she had. She picked up her wine glass, held it out like she was about to make a toast, and looked around the table with a smile that was just warm enough to fool someone who didn't know her. Then she said, bright and clear so everyone could hear, "I just want to take a second to talk about Emma." The table went quiet. My mom set down her fork. Patricia looked up. My uncle stopped mid-chew. Ethan looked at me, then at Lisa, then back at me. I kept my face completely neutral and waited. Lisa let the silence sit for just a beat too long before she continued, her voice carrying that particular tone, the one that sounds like concern but is actually a knife. "I've been going through a really hard time lately. A lot of you know my business hit some serious problems earlier this year. I lost almost everything I'd built. And during that time, I reached out to my sister for help." She paused, glanced at me briefly, then looked back at the table and said, "She said no," just like that, flat. 2 words dropped into the middle of Thanksgiving dinner, like a stone into still water. I could feel the ripple move around the table. My Aunt Carol shifted in her seat. Patricia's expression changed. My mom looked down at her plate, which told me everything. Because my mom not jumping in immediately meant she'd already heard this version of the story and had decided which side she was on. I said, keeping my voice calm and even, "That's not the whole picture, Lisa." She turned to me with wide, almost wounded eyes and said, "Then what is the whole picture, Emma? Because from where I'm standing, I was drowning, and you watched." Right then, something slow and hot started moving through my chest. Not panic. Anger. The controlled kind that I'd spent years learning to manage in courtrooms when opposing counsel was being deliberately misleading. Because what Lisa was doing right now was exactly that. She was presenting a selective version of events to an audience that didn't have the context to push back, and she was doing it at a dinner table instead of a deposition, which meant the rules were different and she knew it. I said, steadily, I explained my reasons to you at the time. Signing a $250,000 loan on a business with those financials wasn't something I could do responsibly. I have Ethan to think about. Lisa let out a short, humorless laugh and said, glancing around the table like she was inviting everyone to share the joke, responsible, right, that's what we're calling it. My mom, who had been quiet until that moment, looked up and said quietly but pointedly, Emma, your sister needed you. And just like that, the table shifted. I could feel it. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a room shifts when the thermostat drops a few degrees. People started looking at me differently. Not with hostility exactly. More with that particular uncomfortable expression people get when they've decided someone is probably in the wrong but don't want to say it out loud. I looked at my mom and said, I understand Lisa was in a difficult position, but I also had to protect my own financial stability. That's not selfishness, that's responsibility. Lisa jumped back in before my mom could respond, her voice picking up heat now, the composed facade starting to crack at the edges. You know what's funny, Emma? You talk about responsibility all the time. Responsibility this, responsibility that. But when it actually came down to it, when I actually needed you, all that responsibility just meant you got to say no and feel good about yourself while I lost everything. The words landed hard. I won't pretend they didn't. Because there's a version of what Lisa was saying that I'd already said to myself at 2 a.m. more times than I wanted to count. The doubt never fully goes away, no matter how right you know you are. I opened my mouth to respond, and Lisa cut me off. She kept going, her voice getting louder, less controlled now, the second glass of wine doing exactly what I'd expected it to do. Do you know what it's like to watch your sister, the big successful attorney, just look at you across her fancy desk and say, sorry, can't help you? Like I was a stranger? Like we didn't grow up in the same house? My Aunt Carol said softly, clearly uncomfortable, Lisa, maybe this isn't the time. Lisa waved her off without looking at her and said, no, I think it's exactly the time. Because we're all sitting here having this nice dinner and nobody's saying what's actually true. My mom reached over and put her hand on Lisa's arm, not to stop her, just to steady her, and that gesture, that small quiet gesture of support directed at Lisa and not at me, felt like a door closing. I was still trying to find the right words, the ones that would actually land, the ones that would cut through the narrative. Lisa had been building without making things worse for Ethan when I heard a chair scrape back from the table. I looked down to my left. Ethan had pushed back slightly from the table. His face was flushed. His jaw was set in that particular way he had when he was trying very hard not to cry, but was also trying very hard to be brave. And then my son spoke up. My 9-year-old son stood up from his chair, looked straight at Lisa, and said, with a steadiness that made my heart crack clean in half, my mom isn't selfish. She works really hard for us. You shouldn't say that about her. The table went completely silent. Not the awkward silence from before. A different kind. The kind that follows something that can't be taken back. For a split second, I saw something flicker across Lisa's face. Surprise, maybe. Or the brief recognition that she'd just been called out by a child and the whole table had heard it. I put my hand on Ethan's arm and said gently but firmly, Buddy, sit down, it's okay. He sat, but he didn't drop his eyes from Lisa. He kept looking at her with that open, unblinking honesty that kids have before the world teaches them to look away. I thought, for just one moment, that maybe that would be it, that Lisa would pull back, that even she had a line she wouldn't cross. I was wrong. Lisa set her wine glass down with a sharp little click and turned to Ethan directly. Her voice shifted into something that was trying to sound patient but wasn't, the tone adults use when they're talking down to a child they've already decided is a problem. She said, Sweetheart, grown-ups are talking right now. You don't really understand what's going on here. Right then, a cold flash moved through me from the back of my neck straight down to my feet. Don't. I thought it so hard it was almost a sound. Don't you dare talk to my son like that. Ethan, to his credit, didn't flinch. He said quietly but clearly, I understand that you're being mean to my mom. Someone at the far end of the table made a small, involuntary sound. I think it was Patricia. Lisa's expression hardened. She leaned forward slightly and said, her voice dropping in a way that was somehow worse than yelling, "You know what your mom taught you? She taught you that it's okay to turn your back on family when they need you. That's what you're learning from her. I hope you remember that when you grow up." The moment those words left her mouth, something inside me that I had been holding in place for the past 2 hours simply let go. It wasn't rage exactly, it was more like a wall coming down, clean and final. Every careful, measured, attorney-trained instinct I had about keeping things calm and not escalating was gone. Because she had just used my child as a weapon. She had looked at my 9-year-old son, who had done nothing except love his mother, and she had tried to plant a seed of shame in him, at a Thanksgiving table, in front of his grandmother, in front of people who were supposed to be family. I stood up. I didn't do it dramatically. I didn't raise my voice, not yet. I just stood up slowly, and I looked at Lisa, and when I spoke, my voice was very quiet and very clear. Do not talk to my son like that. Whatever issue you have with me, you bring it to me. You don't put it on a 9-year-old. Lisa met my eyes and said, her jaw tight, "I'm just telling him the truth." I said, "No. You're using him because you can't win the actual argument." My mom stood up then, on the other side of the table, and said in her firm, final, "This is my house voice. Both of you, that is enough. Emma, please sit down." And the way she said it, the way she directed it at me, only at me, like I was the disruption, and Lisa was just reacting, like my son defending me was the problem, and Lisa going after him was somehow understandable, hit me somewhere I hadn't expected. I looked at my mom. She was looking back at me with an expression I recognized from my entire childhood, the one that said, "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Keep the peace. Be the bigger person. Be reasonable, Emma. You're always the reasonable one." Ethan had moved closer to me without me noticing. His shoulder was pressed against my arm. I could feel him trying to be small and brave at the same time, the way kids do when they sense the adults around them are losing their grip on things. I reached down and put my hand on his shoulder. He was trembling slightly. And that, more than anything Lisa had said, more than my mom's expression, more than the whole long, awful evening, that small tremor under my hand was the thing that decided it. I looked at Lisa, then at my mom, then at the table, full of people who had been sitting there watching this happen and saying nothing, and something settled in me like bedrock. No more managing this. No more absorbing it. No more being the reasonable one, so everyone else could be unreasonable in peace. That was the moment I stopped trying to keep the peace. Then my mother said something I will never forget. She looked at me across that table, with the ceramic turkey centerpiece sitting between us like it had every Thanksgiving for 30 years. And she said, in a voice that was almost gentle, which somehow made it worse, "Emma, I think you should go. Tonight isn't working." Just like that. No, let's all calm down. No, Lisa, that was out of line. No acknowledgement that her daughter's child had just been spoken to like a problem to be managed. Just, "I think you should go." I stood there for a moment and made sure I'd heard it correctly. I had. I said slowly, "You're asking me to leave." My mom straightened slightly and said, "I'm not asking you to leave forever. I just think tonight, given everything, it would be better if you took Ethan home and we all had some space." I looked at her and said, "Lisa just told my son that I'm teaching him to abandon people, and your response is to ask me to leave." My mom's expression shifted into something I can only describe as pained and resolute at the same time, the look of someone who has already made their decision and is now just waiting for you to accept it. She said, "Lisa is going through an extremely hard time right now. She lost her business. She's been staying here because she has nowhere else to go. I need you to understand that." I said, "I understand that. I also understand that none of that gives her the right to say what she just said to my kid." From across the table, Lisa said, her voice quieter now but still carrying that sharp edge underneath, "If you'd helped me when I asked, none of this would be happening." And my mom, without missing a beat, without looking at Lisa to signal her to stop, just said to me, "Emma, you have to understand how she feels." Right there. That was it. That was the sentence. Not Lisa. That was wrong. Not we need to address what was just said to Ethan. Just. You have to understand how she feels. I had spent my entire life in this family being asked to understand how Lisa felt. When Lisa failed her exams and I had to give up a summer program so the family money could go toward her tutoring, I was asked to understand how she felt. When Lisa's first relationship fell apart and she spent 3 months living in my apartment, eating my food and crying on my couch, I understood how she felt. When she called me drunk at midnight for years, I picked up the phone because I understood how she felt. And every single time, the question of how I felt was treated like a secondary concern at best and an inconvenience at worst. Something broke open in me then. Not loudly. It wasn't a dramatic crack. It was more like a slow, quiet collapse, the way an old structure finally gives way, not from one big blow, but from years of pressure accumulating in the same spot. I felt Ethan press closer against my side. I looked down at him and saw his face, red around the eyes, trying so hard to hold it together. He looked up at me and said in a very small voice, just for me, "Mom, can we go home?" Hearing those 4 words from him, delivered with that particular kind of exhausted sadness that no 9-year-old should ever have to feel at a family dinner, was the thing that finally broke me open all the way. Not in tears, in clarity. I looked at my mom and I said, very quietly, "I have spent my whole life being the one who adjusts, the one who absorbs, the one who makes things easier for everyone else in this family at the cost of myself. And tonight, Lisa used my son to hurt me, and your response is to ask me to leave and to tell me to understand her feelings." My mom opened her mouth. I kept going, not raising my voice, just continuing, because I needed to finish. "I've understood Lisa's feelings my whole life, Mom. When did anyone in this family stop to understand mine?" The table was absolutely silent. Even Lisa wasn't talking. My Aunt Carol had her hands folded in her lap and was looking at the tablecloth. Patricia was very still. My mom looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before, something between guilt and defensiveness, and she said, after a long pause, "Emma, I love you. But you have to admit that your decision hurt your sister badly. You could have helped her, and you chose not to. That has consequences for the whole family." There it was. Said plainly, finally, after everything. My mother had just told me, in front of everyone, that I was responsible for the consequences of Lisa's behavior tonight because I hadn't co-signed a loan 6 months ago. I stood there and let that sink all the way down. Every version of myself that had ever bent, compromised, swallowed feelings, kept the peace, been reasonable, been the bigger person, all of it lined up in that moment and just looked at me. And then my mother said, with a finality that left no room for interpretation, "I think you should get your things, Emma. This is my house, and I'm asking you to leave." Across the table, Lisa said nothing. She didn't have to. She just lifted her wine glass and looked out the window. Ethan had started to cry quietly against my arm. I put my arm around him and held him close. I didn't cry. I didn't move for a long moment. I just stood there, holding my son, in the house I'd grown up in, having just been told to get out by my own mother while my sister watched in satisfaction. And that's when I decided. I was done being the reasonable one. I was done absorbing. I was done leaving quietly. I looked at my mom and I said, in a voice so steady it surprised even me, "Okay, but before I go, there's something you need to know about this house." I took a deep breath, looked my mother straight in the eye, and said, calm and clear, "Actually, this house isn't yours." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than anything we'd had that evening. Everything before had been the silence of people holding back. This was the silence of people who had no idea what to do with what they'd just heard. My mom's expression didn't change right away. She looked at me the way you look at someone when you're waiting for the punchline, certain they must be joking. Then, when my face stayed exactly as it was, something shifted behind her eyes. She said, her voice careful and controlled, "What are you talking about, Emma?" I reached into my bag. I'd carried those documents with me for months. Not because I'd planned to use them tonight, not because I'd shown up to Thanksgiving with some kind of ambush strategy. I carried them because, as a real estate attorney, carrying the relevant paperwork for a property you hold in trust is just habit, professional reflex. I pulled out the folder, set it on the table between the sweet potatoes and the cranberry sauce, and said, 6 years ago, Dad put this house into a revocable living trust before he passed. He named me as the successor trustee. When he died, the trust became irrevocable, and the property transferred to my management. Legally, I have been the controlling trustee of this house for the past 4 years. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Lisa had put her wine glass down. My Aunt Carol was staring at the folder on the table like it was something that had fallen from the ceiling. My mom was very still, her hands flat on the tablecloth, her face doing something I had never seen it do before. She was searching, going back through years of memory, trying to find the moment this had happened, trying to figure out if she'd known, if she'd missed something, if this was real. She said, and her voice had lost all of its earlier certainty, "Your father never told me that." I said, gently but without softening the facts, "Dad talked to me about it about 8 months before he died. He was worried about the estate. He wanted to make sure the house was protected and that things were handled properly. He trusted me to manage it. We worked with his attorney together. You were listed as a life tenant, which means you have the legal right to live here for the rest of your life. But the property itself, the title, the trust, the decisions about what happens to this house, that's been under my authority since the trust became irrevocable." My mom looked at the folder. She didn't reach for it. She said, her voice barely above a whisper, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because you were grieving. Because the terms of the trust protected your right to stay here and nothing about your daily life was going to change. Because I didn't see any reason to make it complicated when it didn't need to be." From across the table, Lisa's voice came back hard and fast. "That's not possible. Dad would have told us. He would have told Mom." I turned to look at her and said, steadily, "He told me," and his attorney prepared the documents. "It's all there in that folder, recorded with King County. You're welcome to have your own attorney review it." Lisa pushed back from the table and said, her voice rising, "This is insane. You're making this up. You brought fake documents to Thanksgiving dinner to what? Threaten us?" I said, and I kept my voice completely flat because I had spent 12 years in rooms with people who raised their voices when the facts weren't going their way, and I knew exactly how to hold a position under pressure. I didn't bring them to threaten anyone. I brought them because I always have them. I'm a real estate attorney, and this is a property I'm the trustee of. But since Mom just told me to get out of this house, I think the ownership structure is relevant information. My mom made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She pressed one hand to her mouth. Patricia reached over and put a hand on her arm. The guests at the far end of the table were completely motionless, caught between wanting to witness this and wanting to be anywhere else on earth. Lisa stood up fully now, her chair scraping back, and pointed at me across the table. "You've been sitting on this for 4 years, and you never said anything? While Mom stressed about property taxes, while we talked about what would happen to the house someday, while all of that was happening, you just quietly held on to this and said nothing?" I said, "The property taxes have been paid out of the trust account, which I manage, every single year. The house has been maintained. Nothing about Mom's life in this house has been affected by the trust structure. Because that's what Dad asked me to do. Protect the house and protect Mom's ability to stay in it." Lisa laughed, and it was a sharp, disbelieving sound with no humor in it. "So you've been in control this whole time?" "This whole time," I said. "Yes." Another silence, longer this time. My mom slowly reached out and pulled the folder toward her. She opened it. She looked at the first page. The trust document with my father's signature, his attorney's notarization, the recording stamp from the county. Her hands were trembling slightly. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she closed the folder and looked up at me, and her expression had changed entirely. The certainty was gone. The alignment with Lisa was gone. What was left was something rawer and harder to look at. Something that was partly grief and partly the particular shame of realizing you have been wrong in a way that can't be easily walked back. I said, and I meant it, "Mom, I was never going to do anything to destabilize your life in this house. Dad trusted me to take care of it, and I have. That was never going to change." Lisa said, her voice now quieter but still tight. "So what are you saying? Are you threatening to kick us out? Is that what this is?" I looked at her for a long moment, and I thought about what my father had actually asked me to do. He hadn't asked me to use the trust as a weapon. He'd asked me to protect the house and protect my mom. And standing there in that dining room, holding my son's hand, having just been told to leave by a woman who didn't actually have the legal authority to tell me that, I made a decision. I said, "No, I'm not threatening anyone. Mom has the right to live in this house for the rest of her life, and that doesn't change. But what does change is this. I'm done being treated like I don't belong here. I'm done being talked to the way I was talked to tonight. And I'm done letting my son sit at this table and be used as a target." I looked at Lisa directly and said, "You want to have a real conversation about the loan, about the business, about any of it. I'm willing to do that. Privately, like adults. But what happened tonight, using Ethan, that's done. That doesn't happen again." Lisa stared at me. My mom stared at me. The whole room was still. Ethan was pressed against my side, quiet now, his hand in mine. And just before I picked up my bag and told him it was time to go, I looked at my mom one more time and said, quietly, "I love you." That part hasn't changed. But what I said next changed everything. 2 years have passed since that Thanksgiving night, and my life looks completely different now. Ethan is 11. He's doing well in school, he made the soccer team this year, and last week he told me completely out of nowhere that he wants to be an architect when he grows up, because he likes figuring out how things are built. I told him that sounded exactly right for him. And I meant it. As for my mom and Lisa, I haven't had a real conversation with either of them since that night. There were a few text messages in the weeks that followed. Short ones, careful ones. The kind where everyone is technically communicating, but nobody is actually saying anything. I didn't respond to most of them, not out of cruelty, out of self-preservation. Because I've learned, slowly, and with a lot of honest reflection, that there is a difference between keeping a door open and standing in a doorway letting cold air in. The trust is still in place. My mom is still in that house, as she has every right to be. I've continued managing the property the way my father asked me to, quietly and responsibly, the same way I always have. That part of my commitment to my dad hasn't wavered. What has changed is everything else. I stopped carrying the guilt. That took longer than I expected, because guilt is a stubborn thing when it's been living in you since childhood. For months after that Thanksgiving, I'd lie awake at 2 in the morning running the loop. Should I have co-signed the loan? Should I have handled the dinner differently? Should I have told my mom about the trust years earlier? Was Lisa right that I was selfish? Was my mom right that my decision had consequences for the whole family? I sat with all of those questions. I took them seriously. I talked them through with a therapist I started seeing about 3 months after that night, which was one of the better decisions I've made as an adult. And what I came to, slowly, was this. Accountability is not the same as blame. I can look clearly at my choices and own them without accepting a version of events where my refusal to risk financial ruin for my son makes me the villain of someone else's story. There's something else I want to say, because I think it matters. A lot of people, when I've shared pieces of this story, want to know if I regret revealing the trust that night, whether I think it was the right move or whether it was just anger talking. Honestly, I think it was both. I was angry, absolutely. But I also genuinely believe that the truth needed to be on the table, not as a threat, but because my mom had just told me to leave a house I'd been quietly protecting for 4 years without ever asking for recognition or gratitude. Sometimes the truth comes out at the wrong moment. That doesn't make it the wrong truth. What I know now, 2 years out, is that you can love your family and still recognize that a relationship is hurting you. You can grieve the family you wished you had, while also accepting the one you actually have. You can hold space for someone's pain without making yourself the permanent container for it. And you can be a responsible, loving, present mother to your child while also being a person with limits. Those things are not in conflict. They never were. I set boundaries not because I stopped loving my family, but because I finally loved myself enough to stop accepting the version of love they were offering me, the kind that only worked when I was shrinking. Ethan asked me once, a few months after that night, whether I was sad that we didn't see Grandma anymore. I thought about it for a long time before I answered him. Then I said, "Yeah, buddy, I am sad about it. And it's okay to be sad about something and still know it was the right call." He nodded like that, made complete sense to him. Kids are like that sometimes. They cut right through to the thing. So here's where I land, 2 years later, sitting in my house in Seattle with my kid down the hall doing his homework and a cup of coffee going cold on my desk because I got caught up telling you this story. I don't know what the future looks like with my mom and Lisa. I don't know if there's a version of repair that's actually possible or whether the distance is permanent. What I know is that I stopped waiting for people who had consistently deprioritized me to suddenly decide I was worth showing up for. And that, more than anything, is what gave me my life back. So tell me, would you have done the same?